exposure, and of course once it's passed on into the body, without getting too technical, what dioxin does is dioxin gets into the heart of the body. It gets into the DNA, and it starts to manipulate the way the body actually functions. So it changes, and of course it concentrates as well. There's no point in me going into the science of it because it doesn't mean anything. All I can say is that nobody knows exactly how many Vietnamese were exposed, but one thing they do know, officially they say that 1 million Vietnamese were born disabled as a consequence of the Agent Orange, and that's pretty clear. In a legal complaint that was filed in the US federal court there a few years ago, it was claimed that 3 million Vietnamese suffer from the side effects. But the unofficial figure is that out of the total population of Vietnam, which is around 82 million, somewhere around 5 million people have got some kind of relationship with dioxin. Now, I'm talking about a direct relationship. Now, I'm not talking about just a cursory thing. I'm talking about people who've actually died as a result of illness, contracted as a result of exposure to dioxin, people who've been disabled, people who've got cancer, people who've got other illnesses right across the board. So it's fairly horrendous.
Yeah. Does it change the DNA? It's a mutagenic substance, isn't it? So it's actually changing the DNA of these people.
Yeah, I mean, the effects that it actually have are so wide-ranging and this is the reason why for years and years the industry was able to come around and say, look, we really don't know what the damage is, because they were telling the truth. They didn't actually know, and they still don't know. It's remarkable that it's something like the amount of dioxin that exists in the general population is sufficient to cause damage. So once that increases, then it acts as a reservoir in the body. It sits in the body, and then it can. The worst thing that you can actually do with dioxin is it's stored in the fat cells, and if you start to lose weight, for example, for anything, which can be illness, then the dioxin doesn't mysteriously vanish out of the body. It disappears into the body. It gets into the bloodstream, and it gets into all the various different organs. And depending on what it does with those organs, is how it changes everything. But it does everything. You name it, everything. The organs, the brain, the DNA, which is, I mean, people thought at first that it just caused cancer, and it was a number one carcinogen, but it goes much deeper in that it affects the DNA, but it affects the DNA in a way that scientists still cannot find out, simply because they don't know, because it's the difficulty of any kind of toxin that gets into the body. It's working in aggregation with other toxins, and it's also working in aggregation with people's diets. And of course, this is where the other issue comes in: is that not only is dioxin a disaster zone because of the exposure in the 1960s and early 70s, you have a scenario now, for example, where there's a fellow, he's a dioxin scientist called Arnold Schechter, and he did some studies of families near Ho Chi Minh City, and they would have been fish eaters, and fish, of course, being fish, can take up the dioxin into their system, and he found that the amount of dioxin levels found 2-3 decades after Agent Orange had been sprayed was still getting into the food chain, and people had fairly high elevated blood dioxin levels, because that's one of the ways in which you test dioxin in the body. So it affects people in Vietnam in so many different ways. You've got people who would have been exposed initially, and then you've got people who are exposed, communities who are exposed to dioxin, hotspots, probably the best way to put it, they're called hotspots, where there would be a lot of dioxin, and that dioxin would bioaccumulate in fish and in animals, and that's why it's still a major problem in Vietnam today, because it's actually in their food chain now. So of course, the more people who get exposed to it through the food chain, the more people will get it. So you've got a scenario where instead of dioxin going away in Vietnam, it's not. And of course, the only way to get it out of the food chain is to get it out of the rivers and the lakes and out of the sediment and out of the grass and the soil where it's picked up by obviously the fish in the rivers and the lakes and by the animals, ducks and things like that would pick it up as well.
Who's actually to blame for this? Where's the finger to be pointed at? Who's taking the blame? Who's accepting responsibility?
Well, probably the best way to answer that is to actually give you another quote here, which is an interesting one. There's a woman who works for the Fund for Reconciliation and Development Vietnam program. She's an American in New York, a woman called Susan Hammond, and she's very perceptive about all of this. And I'll just tell you what she said. She said that it's a very political issue, and she argues that one of the reasons why the U.S. state will not take responsibility for this, even though essentially this is a war crime, and it's as much of a war crime as anything that happened in the Balkans. And of course, she says the U.S. cannot take responsibility because it would open up Pandora's box. It would destroy the U.S. economy if the government took responsibility for the effects of Agent Orange or any other weapon of war. It would also limit their ability to produce the weapons that they want to produce. And of course, whilst you can now blame this current American administration, the Bush administration, this goes all the way back to the administration of Kennedy. And lots of people think that Kennedy was a very benign kind of character, but it was Kennedy who actually gave permission for this stuff to be sprayed in the first place. Now, he was under pressure from the military at the time. But yes, if you want to point the finger, and I have no difficulty pointing the finger, you've got to point the finger at basically this wonderful big empire that we've got in the world today, and they're called the USA. The reason you point the finger at them is quite simple, is because they knew before they used it exactly what they were doing. And Congress has known this for some time. And even though the Vietnamese have now tried to take their case as a civil case in the courts in New York City, there's no way the judges are going to allow this, because, as Susan Hammond says, it's just going to open up, you just can't have it. So therefore they're not going to do it. But yes, the blame is there. And it would be dead simple for the US to somehow, and you know, this is all about politics, they don't have to admit anything. All they have to do is find a way of putting money into the Vietnamese economy so that the Vietnamese can spend it on cleaning up dioxin. They don't have to say that's what it's for. They just have to figure out some way of giving the Vietnamese state and the Vietnamese government this money to clean it up, without saying this is exactly what we're giving it to you for. They could say we're giving it to them for building bridges or dams or something else. So the fact that they're not doing this just shows that the US, and as they have been for the last 100-odd years, they've got no respect for people. They've got no respect for dignity, and they've certainly got no respect for anyone other than themselves. And in fact, I'm not even so sure they've even got any respect for their own people. And this whole saga, this whole so-called Vietnamese War saga, has it's a stain on them in a way that the more recent campaigns are not. And at some stage, something's going to have to be done. I'm less into the blame game. I think basically what should happen here is quite simple. I think that the UN should do something, because the UN's probably in a stronger position. Maybe what could happen is that the UN could put pressure on the Americans to provide money, and then the UN go in and do something. But the reason they're not doing anything is because, as far as they're concerned, they're little people. The fact that these little people actually defeated them in a war in which the US used, well, I mean, obviously apart from the chemical weapons where they had fantastic military hardware, they still lost the war. And you know, you could be petty and say that one of the reasons that the Americans are doing this is because they lost the war. This is the only way they can get back at these people. But there's also all sorts of other factors involved, and you know, nothing is insurmountable. There are solutions to everything, and people don't want to find solutions in this particular case. So to go back to my book, I'm not going to make any case in this book. All I'm going to do is to put together a book that's going to tell the stories of exactly who's suffering, and hopefully, if the book gets into the public domain sufficiently, that a few people will read it and go, "Wow, didn't know that. Why aren't we doing something about it?" And and the generations that are coming up, who, I'm not saying they're less disposed towards all this warlike activity of the last 100 odd years,